I have the bounty of talking about the Baha'i law and giving an introduction to it. And I wanted to give this talk because, you know, in my time as a Baha'i, I've often seen people start to explore the Baha'i faith who are attracted to its universal principles, and all of those things are so completely true and valid. But then they happen upon, or they come upon, the Baha'i laws, particularly the laws of personal conduct. And those are laws that Baha'u'lláh instituted for our spiritual and personal development. But they often sort of withdraw or sort of stop their interest because they look at them and say, well, I'm either not living up to that standard, or I don't want to live up to that standard, or I don't believe in that standard. And so they sort of retreat and they stop their investigation. And I actually think that's a real shame. And I wanted to have this opportunity to talk about Baha'i law and the beauty and wisdom behind Baha'i law so that people can appreciate it. There's a lot more to it than just a list of rules. And so I really wanted to dig into it so that people also will dig into it as well on their own. So let me start with a basic truths of the Baha'i faith, because we want to start all these talks with an assumption that people know little about the Baha'i faith. So the basic truths of the Baha'i faith, that there is one God, and who is the ultimate source of all reality, unknowable in his essence. The great religions of humankind, all of them, all the great ones that we know about, have come from the same God and are a reflection of the divine will. But because the world is always evolving and changing, the revelations of God also change, and they adapt their standards to the age in which they appear. So Baha'is believe there's one God, there's really just one religion of God that appears at different times in history, reflecting the evolution of humanity's consciousness at that time in history. And that process really represents, you know, our closest relationship with God. And so, you know, the Baha'i faith claims simply to be Baha'u'lláh revealed a religion that he claimed represented the standards for God for our time in history. So it's not, it's part of the grand religious experience of humanity. And the central principle of Baha'u'llah's revelation is the oneness of humanity. But Baha'u'lláh, in the course of revealing his religion, also gave laws for people to follow. And what I'm going to focus, there are several different laws, but I'm going to focus on what I might refer to as the laws of personal conduct. I am trying to move my thing. Hang on just a second. I'm sorry. I'm going to move that there. There we go. So these are things that Baha'is are sort of enjoined to do as part of their own lives every day. This is only a sample. There are others, but this is kind of a representative sample, if you will. So we are to pray and meditate every day. We are to serve humanity selflessly. We are to avoid criticism and expressions of our own ego in criticism of others. We avoid gambling. We avoid intoxicating substances and alcohol. We are enjoined to engage in an occupation or work. And then probably the most controversial, we express our sexuality, or are asked to express our sexuality heterosexually within the context of marriage, which is obviously the traditional standard of all the great revelations of God. It's been reiterated by Baha'u'lláh and his. So, you know, I think when folks look at this list, some of the time, some sort of this will turn off their interest. Because, you know, maybe you enjoy going to Atlantic City with your friends, or to Las Vegas with your friends and doing some gambling. Or alcohol may be part of your social life, and you meet with your friends and have some beers when you watch a football game. And you don't want to be outside of that, right? So you're exploring this religion, but you still don't want to be really outside of, there's a peer pressure to continue doing some stuff that you've traditionally done. Or maybe you really like drinking alcohol, or you really like gambling, which is proliferated a lot. And then the issues of sexuality are always issues that people have trouble with. And so, you know, I wanted to go into this and say, this is not just a bunch of laws and rules. There's purposes behind each of these, and the purpose is a beautiful one. And once you understand that, you can see them in a whole new light. So I'm asking people to go a little deeper. All right, now why didn't that work? Yes, okay. So the classic sort of religious law that everybody knows are the Ten Commandments. These were revealed 3,000 years ago to tribal peoples in the Middle East, and they became the structure of Christian law as well as in many ways the structure of Islamic law. And if you look at them, they've become, standards by which our civil society operates. We don't kill, we don't commit adultery, we don't steal, we don't lie, and so forth, right? And they become, but they're spoken with a voice of thou shalt. They're very top down, right? It's a list of, you got to do this, right? So they're sort of a list of rules, or they seem like they're a list of rules. I would argue, I'm actually a little struck because I hadn't read these in a long time, when I pulled up the slide and read it, there's actually a lot of spirituality in there, but I think they strike people as sort of this list of basic rules that you should follow. The Baha'i laws are not framed that way. They are given by Baha'u'lláh in a context that is very different. And so I think I want to go through that context. So, Baha'u'lláh says, think not that I've revealed to you a mere code of laws. Nay, rather we, meaning God, we, the royal we, have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. So he says these laws are like the most delectable wine, right? They're the most beautiful thing that you could possibly experience, right? So they're not just a mere code of laws. Part of the process of following them is really to engage in a process in which you are experiencing the best that life can offer, right? So that's a little bit different framing, right? So to me, the Baha'i teachings, or my understanding of Baha'i law starts with the issue of purpose. And so, the fundamental idea of religion generally is that human beings are born into the world with a purpose, right? And so that we have a purpose to grow spiritually, to develop our characters, to develop our personhood or our intellect, to more reflect the nobility of our humanity, right? So that's a wonderful thing, right? That means that we're not all living meaningless lives. We're leading lives of purpose. But whenever you set a directionality to things, right? When you say you're here for something, it imposes certain challenges upon you that you have to strive for those things, right? So I think that underlying the whole concept of Baha'i law is the fact that we are here for a purpose. So then the purpose of religion is to help develop our purpose, right? To express that. And the purpose of laws within that religion also serve the primary purpose, which is to grow spiritually. So, I was very struck when I was a new Baha'i and I was reading a passage, a story, I think it was about Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son, when he was in this country. And somebody had asked Abdu'l-Baha, what is the purpose of life? And Abdu'l-Baha gave this answer. He said, to acquire virtues. And I have to say that at the time, I remember being struck, not that the answer was unique, but that he gave an answer, because I was really early in my exploration of the Baha'i faith and understanding of it. And I was a little surprised that he spoke that humans have a purpose, because I had sort of inherited this idea that nobody knew the purpose of life, that it was sort of unknown. Well, the reality is the great religions of humanity have been telling us the purpose for thousands of years. So, and they've been telling us that it is to acquire virtues, right? So this is, by the way, not Abdu'l-Baha in the picture. It is an individual pondering the purpose of life. So one of the beautiful passages of Baha'u'lláh is he says that we have been created noble, and that we need to rise up to that purpose. So God says, through the voice of Baha'u'lláh, noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created, right? So we're like these hot air balloons that need to get out of the earth and go up into the heavens, right? So the way the Baha'i writings talk about this is similar to other revelations of God. And that is that if you look at human beings, there's basically two natures in humanity. We have our lower nature and we have our higher nature. Our lower nature reflects our desires for competition, satisfaction of our ego, sex, pleasure, physical pleasure, and money, wealth, all of these things that sort of feed our ego. So the Baha'i writings talk about the world, and what they mean by the world is what is this sort of metaphorical world, where this world that we live in is a place of ego, competition, conflict. And then what Baha'u'lláh tells us is that world that we live in, that is ego-driven and fleeting, is actually very transient and very hollow. And it's actually a place of suffering and loss. And that it reflects our lower nature. And that ultimately that world, the world in which our egos are fed and our pleasures are fed, is actually unreal. And it doesn't last. It doesn't last beyond the grave. And of course, Baha'is believe that we last beyond the grave, but that doesn't last beyond the grave. So what we take with us to the next world is none of those things. We don't take our titles, we don't take our money, we don't take anything. We take the degree to which we have developed our higher nature into the next world. Baha'u'lláh, a famous line, warns us. He says, the world is but a show, vain and empty, bearing the mere semblance of reality. So that sets up a process that human beings in their spiritual, moral, personal development need to go through in order to perfect themselves. And that is to detach ourselves from all of these elements, the ego, competition, conflict, all of these things, our own desires for pleasure and so forth, and fill it up with a new sort of sublime reality. And that's what religion is asking us to do. All religions are asking us to do this. And all religions state that humans are not really inherently from the world. Our true place is beyond that. And the process of becoming truly human is moving from the transient to the eternal, from the concrete to the abstract, living your life based on eternal principles and truths, and not being attached to all of those elements that feed our ego. Going from our lower nature to our higher nature, moving from being animals to being truly human, and so forth. So that's the purpose of life. And eventually we get to a stage as we go through this process where our real longings are actually to be closer to God, and we're not sorrowful other than that we're far away from God, and we don't rejoice other than we're close to God. So this beautiful passage in the writings of Baha'u'lláh, speaking with the voice of God, says, sorrow not, save that thou art far from us. Rejoice not, save that thou art drawing near and returning unto us. So everything else we experience is part of the human experience, and we can enjoy it, and we should. But when our primary priority is being close to God, then it frames everything in a different way, as opposed to being attached to those experiences. So some beautiful ideas in all the great religions of humanity. You know, I wanted to point out the temple, the Baha'i House of Worship in New Delhi, India, is shaped as a lotus flower. And the reason it's shaped as a lotus flower is because the lotus flower, which is on the left here, was the symbol of Indian spirituality, a beautiful flower that arises out of the muck and mud of the world, if you will, right? So that's us. We're a beautiful flower arising out of the world of ego and attachment and everything else. So there's another beautiful metaphor that Baha'u'lláh uses that I find helpful in thinking through the purpose of Baha'i law. And this is from a tablet that is in gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'lláh. It's a somewhat mystical tablet, but it's very beautiful. And he speaks to all of us, to all humanity. And he says, you are even as the bird, which soars through the full force of its mighty wings with complete and joyous confidence through the immensity of the heavens, until, impelled to satisfy its hunger, it turneth longingly to the clay of the earth below it, and having been entrapped in the mesh of its desire, finds itself impotent to resume its flight to the realms whence it came. Powerless to shake off the burden weighing on its sullied wings, that bird, hitherto an inmate of the heavens, is now forced to seek a dwelling place upon the dust. So this is beautiful. And if you're not familiar with the writings of Baha'u'lláh, the language is exquisite in all of the writings of Baha'u'lláh. It's majestic and unbelievable. But let me just sort of go through that. So, you know, Baha'u'lláh is saying, imagine this bird. It's flying through the heavens, right? Free, independent, can go anywhere it wants, right? That's the essence of our spirit. That's the essence of our soul, right? But then we get satisfied, we get hungry, right? We go down to the earth, we start eating, and then we get trapped there, right? We get trapped and our wings become sullied with dirt, the dirt of the world, right? And then we can't get the strength to fly again, right? I see this a lot, of folks that are just gems of people, but their wings are so sullied because they're pulled down into the muck and mud of the world, right? And so Baha'u'llah is telling us that our true station is that bird that is spiritually flying, right? So when we think about the laws of Baha'u'llah, what he's trying to do is to get us to be those birds that is flying throughout the heavens again, right? Another wonderful analogy that I like, or a metaphor that is somewhat in the Baha'i writings, is this idea of a path through the wilderness, and that we are all on a spiritual path, right? We're all seeking, actually, ultimately, every human being is seeking spiritual fulfillment. That's the fundamental nature of who we are. But we look for it everywhere, and we look for it in material things, and we look for it in relationships, and we wander through these woods. And there's this wonderful passage where Baha'u'llah says, "Be not of those who wander in the wilderness of their own desires." And so it's this idea that, sometimes we dart this way and dart that way, and we really can't find our way, and it's dark in that forest. And what really is happening is, I believe, is the great revelations of God and the great religions of humanity are helping us plot a course out of the wilderness. And, if you think of the words that are used in religion, salvation, there's a lot having to do with light, right? To shine light and knowledge, and also act as to illuminate the path, right? There's a lot of this language in religion sort of helping us understand that there is a path and a purpose, and we could follow that path to get out of the woods. So there's some beautiful metaphors in religion, but I wanted to use that to kind of these ideas help us to understand the purpose of things. So Baha'u'llah says that the messengers of God have come into the world, and he refers to them in this passage as the day star of truth, right? So day star is like the sun, right? It's an old name for the sun as it rises. So they're the sons of truth. And he says, through the teachings of them, the day stars of truth, every man will advance and develop until he attaineth a station at which he can manifest all the potential forces with which his inmost true self hath been endowed. So God wants us to manifest all the forces that exist within us, all the spiritual forces, and to become our true selves, and then express that, right? And then Baha'u'llah goes on to say it's for that purpose that the revelations of God have come into the world. So now I recently started my kids on piano, and my kids hate piano. So they really don't want to do it. And it's been very much a fight. And they find it boring. They find practice boring. They find it purposeless. They don't want to do it and all that. But when I'm driving in the car with my son and we're listening to music, I see him tapping to the music. And when we have to do some things that involve rhythm, I see he's got a really good sense of rhythm. And my daughter, when she sings songs, usually from the movie Frozen or something, she's always in tune. And so I know they have some natural musical ability. So it's my responsibility as a parent to really nurture that ability, right? And have them do something that they don't want to do, right? So they're going to go through this process. And I took them to the teacher, and he started to make some rules, right? He said, well, you're going to have to do this, practice every day. And then he told them not to do certain things. Don't practice it this way, right? So rules are really, ultimately, when they're given out of love, there to help us manifest our true potential and help us guide on a path. That's what the piano teacher is doing. But my kids know that. They know that I'm doing this out of love for them, and I want them, and I've expressed that to them many times, as much as they've protested. And it strikes me in this piano teacher relationship that, we go to that teacher because we trust that teacher knows something that we don't know and knows the potential that lies within us. And we sort of admit our own ignorance. We say, I don't know anything about this. Please teach me. And then they teach us the rules that we need to do in order to bring that out of us, right? So it strikes me that really, ultimately, in free societies, obedience to laws and standards should be an act of love and trust, okay? Because I trust that piano teacher, and I love my parent, and they're making me do this, and therefore I listen to what they say. So this is, I think, one of the central ideas that Baha'u'lláh revealed. It's different from the 10 Commandments, right? Because Baha'u'lláh tells us that the revelation of God in this day is structured entirely on the idea of love, and that we obey laws for our love of God. But God doesn't get anything out of it. We're the ones who get something out of it. But the purposes of us doing it is not just to be obedient or just because we want to follow a bunch of laws, but it's a conscious knowledge that, just like going to the piano teacher, it's a conscious knowledge that if I follow these laws, I'll be able to manifest my full potential. And I always love this passage that is in the beginning of Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws, where he says, obey my laws for love of my beauty, meaning God's beauty. So the love of God is really a key concept here. And it's really what I think God is teaching us is finding the love of God within ourselves and using that as the path out of the woods. So there is a lot in the Baha'i writings about the love of God. You could argue that every passage is about the love of God. The revelation of God, Baha'u'llah's revelation, is trying to help us to find the strength within us to live lives that fully reflect all our capacities. So in one beautiful passage, Baha'u'llah says, for every one of you, his paramount duty, it's pretty important, this is your most important duty, is to choose for yourself that on which nobody else may infringe, and none usurp from him. Such a thing, and to this the Almighty is my witness, is the love of God. Could you not perceive it? Baha'u'llah says, build for yourself such houses as the rain and floods can never destroy, which shall protect you from the changes and chances of this world. So this passage always struck me, because when you find out about the love of God and you start to incorporate it into your life, you become a stronger person. You build a house that protects you from the changes and chances of the world of suffering, the world of loss. And you become more independent. You become stronger. Religion is sometimes described as being for weak people. That's not true at all. That's the exact opposite of the truth. Religion, as taught by the great revelations of humanity, is to make us strong inside so that we can deal with any of the problems. People who are attached to the world, even though they may be very wealthy and very famous, are very weak people, often, because if you take that away from them, they don't know what to do with themselves. Baha'u'llah tells us that the most powerful people in the world are the people who don't need that in order to live, right? They don't need the power and the wealth. Their love and their purpose is within them. So there's a beautiful passage that I always loved of Baha'u'llah where he says, O you beloved of the one true God. That's all of us, right? Pass beyond the narrow retreats of your evil and corrupt desires and advance into the vast immensity of the realm of God and abide in the needs of sanctity and of detachment, that the fragrance of your deeds may lead the whole of mankind to the ocean of God's unfading glory. So this idea that our attachment to our ego and all of those things that Baha'u'llah tells us not to do are actually sort of narrow places. We like doing those things, but they're actually holding us back, right? They're holding us back from something much greater. And so that framing, that understanding informs, I think, all of the laws of Baha'u'llah, at least from my perspective. So, Baha'u'llah revealed his religion over the course of some 39 years. And from 1853, if you know a little bit about the history of Baha'u'llah, let's just review it very quickly. Baha'u'llah was Persian, was exiled from Persia, and then spent 10 years in the city of Baghdad, which was not in Persia. It was in the Ottoman Empire. And That was from 1853 to 1863. And in 1863, Baha'u'lláh revealed formally announced that he was a messenger of God. And then he spent another 10 years educating the community before revealing his book of laws in 1873. So my point is this, that Baha'u'lláh actually spent 20 years having revealed no laws. So all of his tablets from that period are so interesting because he's building the understanding in the people. So he didn't put the cart before the horse. He didn't give them a list of laws and say, go follow these. He built love within them over 20 years before asking them to do anything. And so, you know, there's this very interesting tablet, and it came out a couple years ago in a volume called The Call of the Divine Beloved. And it's a collection of tablets from Baha'u'lláh while he was in Baghdad, where he was going to the tea houses and interacting with people, and people would come, and he was really out and about. And there was this individual who was very concerned of the fact that there were people who were around Baha'u'lláh who were not exactly following the standards, right? You know, the standards of God have been the standards of God, right? And they just weren't quite living up to the standards. And so he came to Baha'u'lláh with this issue, and Baha'u'lláh reveals this tablet back to him. At least that's what I understand from the context. And so Baha'u'lláh said something really lovely. He said, so long as the name, the ever forgiving, shines resplendent around the horizon of existence, there will be sinners in the world of creation. For the latter cannot appear with the former, and the former cannot exist without the latter. So my interpretation of that passage is he's saying, listen, you know, God is the ever forgiving, and God is always going to be the ever forgiving. And the nature of things is that people are going to be sinners, right? I mean, so, you know, it's like, if you want to stamp out all the sins in the world, you're not going to be able to do that, right? So, but then he says, our aim is to show, and Baha'u'lláh again is using our or we, the plural, to reflect, speaking of the voice of God. He says, our aim is to show that should urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that the differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. Sorry, there's a misprint there. That's former times may not arise anew. And then later in that paragraph, he says, the beginning of the religion is the love for God and his chosen ones, meaning the messengers of God. And its end is to manifest that love to his servants. So love is the foundation of human relationships, right? It's not to judge others. It's not to criticize others. We live in an age of constant criticism. If you spend any time on Twitter, you know this. It's just ridiculous, right? Everybody wants to put forth their ego and make their point and criticize other people and feel good about it for a moment or whatever, right? But Baha'u'lláh is revealing a religion that he says should be based upon love, showing kindness and mercy to others. But then interestingly, at the end of that passage, he says something very interesting. He says, the time will come for the completion of the commandments, meaning I'll reveal my laws when the time is right, and the perfections of deeds will assuredly come. So there will be laws and there will be standards. And he's telling this man there will be, but right now you need to focus on the unity of the community and love. And I think there's a great lesson in that Baha'u'lláh is the manifestation of God himself, had us focus on building spiritual capacity before giving any laws. Okay, so let's get into this then, you know, get into some of the laws a little bit more and talk about them. So one of the laws is the law not to drink alcohol. And so it's so interesting, though, how Baha'u'lláh frames this, right? He just doesn't say, don't drink alcohol. He doesn't take away something from you. He tells you that I want you to choose something higher than that. So he says, become the intoxicated with the wine of the love of God, and not that which deadens your minds, right? And in another passage, he says, the mystic wine of the one true God, meaning love, the love of God, hath a different intoxication and imparts another exhilaration. The one diminishes intelligence, meaning wine itself, physical wine. The other increases intelligence. So the love of God increases intelligence, whereas, you know, alcohol diminishes intelligence. And so, you know, if you look at the circumstances in which people drink wine, and there's social roles, and I'm not very judgmental personally about this. I have friends who drink a glass of wine now and then for dinner, and I don't know if there's anything really all that wrong with that. But, Baha'u'lláh is asking us, though, to, instead of turning to a beverage to fulfill a need we feel within ourselves, we should instead use the love of God to fulfill those needs, particularly if we start getting into the drowning our sorrows thing, right? Because it's an opportunity lost. Sorrows are there for a purpose. The purpose is so that we become more independent, that we use them as something to push off of as we get higher into the heavens. And so, he wants us to replace the physical wine with the love of God, and uses that metaphor a lot. And so, there's nothing really wrong with wine itself. It just becomes a distraction for another process. And so there's an opportunity cost if we use it. So that's just one example. And there are several examples that are similar to that. I want to talk about issues of sex because everybody wants to talk about issues of sex. It's just inundates in our society. It's all over our media. If you were to believe anything in our media, that's the only purpose that we came into the world, and so forth, right? So I'm a doctor. Let me just say this first, right? So, being a medical professional has a way of sort of taking the mystique out of things, right? We spend a lot of time talking to people about their bodies and about sex and other issues related to their bodies. And so, for me as a doctor, I've learned to sort of think of sex in a much more sort of mundane, plain way. There's no mystique in it for me. There's no Hollywood romance about the whole thing. It's, after a while, you sort of get sort of more mature about these issues. So, sex is all around us. There's bees and butterflies, and it's just all around us. And every human being is going to have, most human beings are going to have sex, and they're going to have a lot of sex. So it's not very interesting, right? It's kind of common, it's mundane. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a powerful human instinct, that it's not important to us personally. It's not all of these other things, but religion's purpose is to help us rise above this world, right? To some degree. Not that we don't enjoy it, but it's, but we don't get enmeshed in it so that we don't fulfill our spiritual purpose. So, I think that, unfortunately, I think some of the revelations of God in the past have, their followers have gotten too enmeshed in this whole issue and made a bigger deal out of it than it should be. And it became more problematic. So, I think for Baha'is, what we're trying to do is to really focus on the spiritual aspects of life. And then gradually over time, what happens is, these other aspects of our lives that are powerful impulses fall in line, right? They fall in their proper place. And that's where we want to get. Baha'u'lláh was not used beautiful metaphors of the lover and the beloved to reflect our individual spirits and our souls and our love for God. And in one hidden word, which is passages from Baha'u'llah's writings where God speaks directly to the human heart, says, "I have breathed within thee a breath of my own spirit, that thou mayest be my lover. Why hast thou forsaken me and sought a beloved other than me?" Right? So this idea that God, our relationship with a God is actually a relationship. It's a relationship like any other. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be developed. And we get out of that relationship what we put into it. And as we nurture that relationship, we become a little bit more independent from the other relationships. Not that our relationships with our wives and husbands and girlfriends and boyfriends and others are not meaningful, but it's just that we're more fulfilled and had this independence because we have this relationship with God. So when it comes to the laws of personal conduct, I really do see them as reflecting a spiritual process. And the purpose of them is simply to avoid some of those blind alleys in that path through the woods, some of the potholes in the road that people break down their car, that people get addicted to gambling or they get addicted to intoxicating substances. But avoiding them, just completely avoiding them, allows us to stay on track with our spiritual purpose. And I will note, by the way, that even conflict and contention, Baha'u'lláh prohibited. Let me, before we move to discussion, I want to tackle two issues that I think are important. Because this is very confusing in our society right now, because the followers of the older revelations of God have become very political. And this, you see this in Christianity and so forth. And it's muddied the waters, I think. And I think they've done damage to the faith of God in a global sense. Because they've muddied the waters and they've turned off a lot of people from religion, which I regard as the most beautiful thing that a human being can experience, is these aspects that we've been talking about. And I'm saddened by where things stand right now. But I want to make a very important point, and that is, when we're thinking about the laws of God, they are different from civil law, right? So the laws of God is expressed by Baha'u'lláh and how we should regard them and why we should follow them. That our obedience to them comes from the inside out, okay? It's not because they're imposed upon us. It's because we want to, as an expression of our own love. They are a voluntary expression of our own free will. They are not imposed upon us. And you express them as an expression of your own God-given free will. Spiritual laws are made out of love, meaning their purpose is love, and they're followed out of love, okay? Civil law, on the other hand, and there's this great debate in American society about changing civil laws, whether it have to do with the legalization of marijuana, all the issues with homosexuality and gays and lesbians and rights within the communities and so forth. All of those have to do with civil law. They really have nothing to do with Baha'i law. They're only tangentially related, right? So, but in that context, civil law is has a different purpose, right? It's trying to get groups of people with different mindsets and different ideas about things, all to sort of follow a basic set of standards that allows us to all live together, right? And obedience to them comes from the outside in. They're obligatory to follow, and they're enforced by punishment. And the laws are really made out of necessity, right? One of the things that taught me a lot was when I was doing my master's in public health degree, we studied the process of trying to reduce smoking, tobacco use within the community, within society. And, for years, advocates of curtailing tobacco use and limiting the tobacco lobby and the tobacco companies through legal measures came up against a simple problem, and that is that tobacco appeared to be bad to a person who smokes, but not bad to others. So there was really no legal footing within civil law to make it illegal or to restrict it in any way, because a person was making a choice that is their own choice and putting something into their body that was their own choice. The thing that changed that was the passive smoking also caused lung cancer. And it was actually a fairly weak association, but it was there, that it did cause lung cancer. And so what that allowed there to be some laws about now, because your smoking influenced somebody else, then you had to restrict your smoking in a place where you could hurt somebody else. And so, that led to New York outlawing it in bars and restaurants and so forth. But that was the trigger. And that teaches us something about civil law. Civil law doesn't really care about us, right? It cares just what you're going to do to your other person. It regards you as a free and independent human being to be able to do whatever you want unless you harm somebody else. So you can get a case of beer and get up in your room, hole up in your room and drink it all weekend into oblivion, and it's not illegal, right? It may be very harmful to you personally, but it's not illegal. And the reason it's not illegal is because you're not harming anybody but yourself. But God cares about us, right? He has a higher standard because he does care about us. It's not just about harming others, although we're not supposed to do that too. But God cares about us. So these laws are a higher standard because they're for our own benefit, because God cares how far we are progressing along our spiritual path, each one of us, okay? So the other point I wanted to make, and I put this on the slide sort of last few minutes as I was prepping for this presentation, I think we have to be really careful. If God had wanted to use civil law to force people to act in a certain way, he would have done so. what's happening, what the project of religion is to help people find their inner true inmost selves and live within a beautiful purpose and express that in their lives. It's really not having to do with any of this political stuff we ever talk about. All of that has really nothing to do with spiritual law. And it doesn't mean, like, for instance, because Baha'is don't drink, it doesn't mean that Baha'is advocate that alcohol should be illegal or that it should ever be illegal. Those are two different questions. And so I really wanted to make that clear, because it muddies the waters of discussions of laws. Because people look at the Baha'i faith and say, well, just because you believe this, you must believe that. And that's not necessarily true. They're really different realities. So we can talk about that more. But I've learned that over the time. I want to tell you a theological point that I think is very important. And I noticed it a few years back, and I thought about it a lot. And I think it's really interesting. So there's a beautiful work of Baha'u'lláh known as the Kitab-i-Gan. It's his major theological work, in which he explains the relationship of God to humanity and uses a lot of Christian and Islamic scripture to describe that, and answers a lot of questions about the relationship of God to humanity. And at one point, he's sort of addressing the question of, God is God, right? I mean, God is creator of all that is, right? If God wanted us to do something, he could make us do it, right? It's obvious. Why doesn't he? Why doesn't he make us do it? And this is what this passage is about. Baha'u'lláh says, we're the eternal essence, meaning God, to manifest all that is latent within him. Were he to shine in the plenitude of his glory, none would be found to question his power or repudiate his truth. Nay, all created things would be dazzled and thunderstruck by the evidences of his light, as to be reduced to utter nothingness, right? So if God manifested himself in the world with his real power, I mean, we'd be nothing, right? So we would follow anything he said out of fear. And Baha'u'lláh says his purpose, however, is to enable the pure in spirit and the attached in heart to ascend by virtue of their own innate powers unto the shores of the most great ocean. And what that means, it's this beautiful spiritual idea of the river of life that comes through the revelations of God. So, why did Christ appear as a poor carpenter? Why was the Prophet Muhammad an orphan cattle driver, merchant? Why was Baha'u'lláh a prisoner all his life? Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'lláh, expressed it. He said, the messengers of God come into the world dressed in nothing but their own poverty. But if you sit back and you ask yourself, well, why is that? Right? Well, the reason Baha'u'lláh tells us is because God wants us to find things on our own, right? God that messenger of God could have been the most powerful man on earth, right? And then everybody would do things out of fear. But that's not the way the system works, because God wants us to find things on our own as an expression of our free will. Okay, so the laws of personal conduct, again, and I've highlighted that there's one other that I wanted to address, and that is the issue of homosexuality and so forth. Because, a lot of people now, even if you say that you believe that sex should be expressed between a man and a woman in the context of marriage, you could be called names, right? Being homophobic and so forth. So I really wanted to talk about this because I think that this is an important issue. I think we can learn a lot from this issue as we think through it. So I'm going to give you my own personal feeling here on how I think about this issue, which is very prominent in our society. And I love this sign, actually. True love is born from understanding at an LGBTQ rally. So, in my profession, I've become comfortable with the idea that there are dilemmas that are difficult to solve. We have them all the time in medicine. Every field does. There are, I'm sure, in engineering field problems that are difficult to solve, challenging issues. It's true in physics, it's true in everything. And we set about ourselves, sort of figuring out what we know and what we don't know, and then we sort of work on it. And it may take hundreds of years to figure something out, right? Medicine has evolved over 200 years, and we have thorny problems we can't solve all the time. So I'm not afraid of difficult problems. And this is a difficult challenge and difficult challenges, especially in the social cultural area, are difficult because they really, I think, reflect two somewhat opposing viewpoints, but both of which are accurate. And, one of the aspects of maturity, I think, is to understand that things can be true even if they seem to be in opposition. So on the one hand, and I'll speak sort of about the religious perspective. So on the one hand, it is undeniably true. And I think I had to go through a process of accepting the fact that the scriptures of humanity, and I believe in those scriptures, all of them express that we should not engage in homosexual activity. It's true in the Gospels, although the Gospels are less specific about it, but Christ's standard was evidently very high in the passages that do exist. Relationship between a man and a woman, Christ forbade divorce, and his followers had trouble with those standards. And there are passages in the Gospel where Christ had to explain it because people had difficulty with that. Islam is true, although it's interesting, I think that the scriptures of humanity are more tolerant than are often characterized, and that's true in the Quran. But nevertheless, and this is true in the Baha'i writings. So it's true that if we believe in those scriptures, that God wants us to engage in heterosexual activity as a normative practice. So the other point, I make 2 points. One is that I think it's not a major part of the scriptures, which I think, and there are other aspects of our humanity that are stressed to great degree, sometimes a bit of an afterthought. So it's really not a big deal. God doesn't think it's a big deal. But nevertheless, I think the standard is clear. I also think that, sometimes we get into this argument that, well, these were revealed a long time ago and, they were ancient peoples and we've progressed in our understanding of these issues. And that's true. We have progressed a lot in understanding of these issues, but ancient peoples were very familiar with homosexuality. It was not unknown to them. And so the scriptures addressed it and they addressed it directly. So at some point I had to come to terms with that reality. The other reality, and it's a very true reality, is that, and we've discovered this, I think, more and more as people have been more open about their feelings, is that it is definitely true that certain percentage of the population, any human population, probably throughout history, that a certain percentage of the population experiences gay desires as part of their normal experience. And that is part of their experience. And it's a valid part of being human. And so I think what we struggle with a bit is how to marry these two ideas and be respectful and be fair to people who experience homosexual desires as part of their normal experience. Now, I think it should be said that until about 50 years ago, most people who experience homosexual desires engaged in heterosexual lifestyles. And that's true, still true today. And it's true for millions of people throughout history. And we don't know, that is a story that is somewhat untold. We really don't know about those experiences. My guess is that they probably had a mix, that many of them lived very fulfilling lives. And this wasn't a big deal. But we are in the process, I think, in our societies of really bringing all of this to the surface. And it's coming all to the surface all at once in sort of a big conflagration. And we're trying to sort it out. And I don't have answers. I just have stakes in the ground of things I think are true. And but what we do have as Baha'is, and I think also as professionals, mental health professionals, medical and psychological professionals and others, is we do have a body of a way of addressing challenging issues. And that is to be objective, to be fair, to be loving, to be benevolent, to be beneficent, which is a major feature of medical ethics, to do no harm. And that's definitely a standard within the Baha'i faith as well as in medicine. I'm most familiar with medicine. I'm using medicine as an example, and I think there's some overlap. My point being that we just have to have open discussion and work through it over time. It's not going to be a quick solution. It's not going to be something we'd solve. People have a right to express themselves in any way they want. And there's a letter of the House of Justice, which is the governing body of the Baha'is of the world, from May 9th, 2014. And I found it to be very wise. And I think I'd have everybody read it if they're interested in this issue. And the House of Justice makes several points that I think are very important and distinctive. They said, while Baha'is hold specific beliefs about human identity, sexuality, personal morality, and individual and social transformation, they also believe that individuals must be free to investigate truth and should not be coerced. They are therefore enjoined to be tolerant of those whose views differ from their own, not to judge others according to their own standards, and not to attempt to impose these standards on society. So that's a really important point. It's one of the important differences I'm trying to make between spiritual laws and, Baha'is nowhere in the world are using the political machinery of the world, of that country, to try and get people to follow standards, who are the people who are not Baha'is to follow standards, their Baha'i standards. There's no circumstance in which that's happening for issues of personal morality. It's not happening at all. It's happening in Christian cultures all the time, but it's not happening. And there's a reason for that, because we're not doing that. The House of Justice asks us not to do that. And then, they go on to say, to regard a person who has a homosexual orientation with prejudice or disdain is entirely against the spirit of the faith, and where occasion demands, it would be appropriate to speak or act out against unjust or oppressive measures directed towards homosexuals. But any group of people of whatever persuasion, we are all one family. And, so we can work through this issue together over time. Everybody has a right to express themselves in the way they want within civil society. I believe that strongly. Baha'u'lláh is calling us to a higher standard. That standard is not easy. It's not easy. And it's particularly difficult for individuals of the LGBTQ community, forgive me. And I think that, we have to be extraordinarily empathetic with that challenge. It's very difficult. So that's okay. That's okay. They're difficult problems all the time. So there's one passage that I've always been struck by that talks about this issue of what we're asked to do as Baha'is. And Baha'u'lláh says in one of his tablets, he says, the heaven of true understanding. So imagine you have a star, you have the heaven, meaning the sky, right? The heaven, that's true understanding. The heaven of that true understanding shines resplendent with the light of true luminaries. Imagine the sun and the moon, or just two lights that are shining in the sky, both of which we can follow to get us out of the woods. He says tolerance and righteousness. So those are sometimes on opposite poles, but Baha'u'lláh is marrying them together and saying they are both necessary. Tolerance and righteousness. To me, righteousness means following the laws, right? Tolerance means tolerance, right? So, and then he goes on to say, oh, my friend, vast oceans lie enshrined in that brief saying. Blessed are they who appreciate its value, drink deep therefrom, and grasp its meaning, and woe betide the heedless. So, we're all trying to figure out the balance between strict adherence to laws and tolerance as we're all growing spiritually. And so, keeping these two lights in the heaven of understanding, I think are really important. And the Baha'u'lláh said that directly and so specifically, and said vast oceans lie within that truth. I think we're experiencing that a lot every day. So, the last thing I want to say is that if you are exploring the Baha'i faith, don't let these laws trip you up. This is a magnificent religion, and you will be enriched many times over by studying it. You should, I believe, and I invite you to, explore it within the context of the Baha'i communities. Baha'i communities are open communities. Many people engaged in Baha'i activities are not declared Baha'is. You do not have to. Nobody will ever force you. But you can start to drink deep of the beautiful revelation of God and start to appreciate it. And that's the cart, right? Or that's the horse, So once you develop the love and once you develop the trust, then the other things follow. And that takes time, right? It took Baha'u'llah's followers 20 years before he made them follow a law. So, the last thing I want people to do is get tripped up by the laws. Study the beauty of the faith. And then you can experience it. And then following the laws becomes easy. So with that, I am going to stop my presentation. And I hope I didn't talk too long. I haven't been timing myself. Stop my share. Thank you
you so much for your talk, Dr. Williams. I think it was so deep and really clear cut, helpful for everyone to understand. So now we can have our time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and I will read it out in the order that it's received. So we have one question. It's asking, regarding sexuality, people are born gay. It's not a choice. How do we answer folks who question the law forbidding homosexual expressions of love?
I agree. I think that people are born natively with homosexual desires. I think, of course, it is a choice how to express that. Sexuality is on a spectrum. This is part of the challenge that we're experiencing, right? This is part of this is part of it. And everybody's story is their own. And what I've tried to express in this is that I suppose in some ways we don't know the answer to that question. And that, we're going to learn as people adopt the Baha'i standards and try and engage with them in their lives. So this is an age of knowledge. And people are more open about things than in the past. It was covered, it was in a closet, nobody talked about it. Now we talk about it so that we can understand it. And I think that over time we will come to understand it. Part of it, I think, is to really see each other as souls. These aspects of humanity, of our humanity, which are for political purposes have been sort of labels that people have taken on. And I think they can be quite divisive. What Baha'u'lláh is calling to us to, I believe, is to see each other as human souls, and to think of each other in that way, so that these other aspects become accidental, right? And so I'm cautious not to give pat answers to what I believe is a very difficult and challenging issue that we will undoubtedly learn more about over time. But I think what's most important is that we go through the process in the right way, that we do it with love and understanding and an openness and an open-mindedness, and we don't get defensive. I think sometimes religious people get defensive, and they end up saying things which there's no reason to get defensive. This is a challenging issue. And so that's just my thought on that. I hope I answered the question. I'm not sure I did.
Thank you. Our next question asks, is it okay for Baha'is to have boyfriends and girlfriends Western style? And also, should the law of maximum 95 days of engagement always be only for Iranian and Middle Eastern Baha'is, or is it time for the entire Baha'i world to practice it?
So I want to be careful, because this is a personal perspective on Baha'i law talk. And I'm not a priest or a mullah or anything else. So anything I say should not be regarded. To answer that question, I would go back and look myself at the books, right? I would look and see what the House of Justice had said and so forth. So don't regard anything I say as being, it's just my own personal perspective. So the two questions were about boyfriend and girlfriend in modern society, and how Baha'is feel about that.
Yes. And the law of 95 days of engagement, should that be only for Middle Eastern Baha'is, or should it be extended to the whole world? So
let me do the second part first. I do not believe that Baha'is in the West are as yet under the obligation of having engagements as short as 95 days. To those who don't know what we're talking about, there is a law in Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws that says that once you get engaged, you should be married within 95 days. And the reasons for that we could talk about. But now there are some laws, as the House of Justice has applied the Baha'i laws around the world, that they've applied selectively. This is unusual. It's not common at all. But some cultures were very used to that standard already, other cultures not. And so some cultures, the House of Justice has sort of gradually applied the laws. And so I do not believe, if I'm not mistaken, but it's been a few years since I've thought about this, that it is as yet obligatory on Western Baha'is. The other question, if you could just repeat it, was about...
Is it okay for Baha'is to have boyfriends and girlfriends Western style?
Okay, you're going to only get my opinion. I'm not sure. I think that what do I think about this? It's a very difficult. It depends on what you mean by Western style, right? People. This is my fatherly perception, right? I think that young men and young women need to learn about each other. I think they need to spend time with each other. I think that as much as that can be done in a group, we need to have normal, healthy relationships with members of the opposite sex, and learn to have those relationships. A lot of current secular society, I know when I grew up, there were a lot of relationships between men and women that was really quite unhealthy, and because it was so suffused with sexuality. I think the Baha'i standards actually give a freedom to youth to really learn about each other as people. I'll tell you that once you get married, you're living with another person, okay? They're not the object of anything, right? It's whatever you thought you're living with a person, and that person's going to have habits you like and habits you don't, and so forth. And so the reality of who you're married to will become quickly apparent to you. And I think people need to, so we need to give freedom to have our youth learn about people. And how you balance that with other principles is sort of a private decision.
The next question asks, how do Baha'is celebrate a rest day or Sabbath?
That's a very good question. We don't specifically have a Sabbath. I'm not sure if this is known, but in Middle Eastern cultures that were informed by Islam, Friday was the day off. And I believe at the Baha'i World Center, they observe that as the day off as well. But it has not had the same emphasis within Baha'u'llah's revelation as it did in Judaism and Christianity. Although I'm glad I live in a Christian culture and I get Sundays off. It's kind of nice.
Thank you. The next question asks, generally, we like to pray to God for our healing, happiness, steadfastness, and for our financial health. But still, I can give nothing to God. That is why sometimes I feel so shameful and confused to pray to God. Is it okay for me to feel shame to pray to God just because I can pay nothing to God?
I think you are happening upon a profound spiritual truth, right? And not happening upon it, but you're expressing a profound spiritual truth, that our relationship to God is one of, and this is in the writings many times, and it's very humbling. Everything we've been given comes from the source of all reality, and we really can bring nothing to the table. That's expressed in some beautiful prayers of Baha'u'lláh and Abdul Baha, and the Bab, I believe, as well, of how we really come into this relationship with nothing that has been, nothing of our own, right? In a sense, we've been given everything and given nothing. So, that is the process of prayer. And, I think it's part of coming to terms with our reality as human beings, because ego is a false thing, right? Believing you are independent, we are all completely contingent. We are completely dependent on everything around us. Nothing about us is independent. And so, recognizing that reality, I think, is a profound spiritual truth. So I would say that's a beautiful idea.
Thank you. The next question asks, which written work would be the best to read to learn more about the faith?
That's a very good question. I would say that you do want to read an introductory book. So the classic introduction to the Baha'i Faith was a book written by a doctor in the early 20th century, a British doctor named John Esselmont. It's called Bahá'u'lláh and the New Era. It's a lovely book, and it's been updated several times, and it really has the major features. There's a shorter book by a woman by the name of Gloria Fazey, which is very sort of cut and dry. You can get it on Amazon. Bahá'u'lláh and the New Era, by the way, is online, and it's free. And you can buy it, and it's really just sort of short, just the facts introduction. But I wouldn't necessarily, you want to get something with warmth. There's another book there are several other introductory books out there. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I did when I first became a Baha'i was read the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, because it really helped introduce me to the Baha'i faith and the spirit of it. And then it was through Paul Parrish's music and some other things that I really got keyed into the writings of Baha'u'lláh. This is my writings of Baha'u'lláh. I bought it maybe, I don't know, 35 years ago. It's got misprints. It was a poor copy, but it was the first one that came out that had all the writings of Baha'u'lláh in it. And even smelling the pages makes me feel spiritual. I mean, it's just, it just is imbued. I love it so much. I've prepared it several times. And, you know, when I started reading the writings of Baha'u'lláh, I almost knew nothing about the faith. I knew the basic ideas, but I didn't know the majesty of what he was talking about. Oftentimes I would find myself crying and I didn't even know what he was saying, because the words were so beautiful and the concepts were so beautiful. But you're really going to enter into a sublime world when you read the writings of Baha'u'lláh. The Hidden Words is a wonderful place to start. I usually hand friends the Hidden Words because they're short and they're about ethical precepts, and you kind of know what he's talking about. So I would get, if I were exploring, I'd probably get an introductory book on the faith, and I'd get the Hidden Words of Baha'u'lláh, and I would start to meditate on what they mean.
Thank you.
But you know what I would also do? I would join a Ruhi group, join a study circle, because they're wonderful, and they really, you can start to, and those are throughout the Baha'i world. You should definitely join a study circle, and they start from very simple, and you work through the writings and you do it as a group, and it's really a lovely experience.
Great. Our next question says, I thought fasting was the one thing God asks us to do for him. Is that in Islam?
You thought fasting was the one thing that God what?
Asks us to do for him. I guess the question's asking, like, what are the Baha'i laws of fasting?
Yeah, so Baha'is do fast for 19 days. It starts basically March 1st to the 20th. It ends, or the March 2nd to the 21st, depending on the year. And it ends the first day of spring. And during those 19 days, we do not eat or drink from sunrise to sunset. So you're going a whole day without eating or drinking. And then you're eating, and then you're going to turn around and you're going to get up the next morning, and then you're going to fast again. And you do that for 19 days. And it's a wonderful time where it's supposed to be intended to focus on spirituality and not so much on food and other pleasures. And it's actually a wonderful experience. It is not easy. It is really hard. But you know, when you can do it, when I say really hard, everybody's different. Some years I found it to be easy. Some years I found it to be really hard. But it's just hard enough to make you work for it. And I think that's one of the wonderful experiences of fasting. And it gets to my point that I was trying to make in the Baha'i law, is that, you know, things that are worth something are not easy, right? You have to work for them. And that's one of the things about the law of fasting.
Great. While we're waiting for more questions, I had one of my own. So I was wondering, sometimes I'm reading the Baha'i laws and I see things that I don't necessarily understand. They're like from an Eastern perspective. So I was wondering, like, why does Baha'u'lláh include those things in his writings?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I wanted to cover that in the talk, actually, because if you were to pick up the Book of Laws of Baha'u'lláh, you would encounter things you just don't know. You don't have any background to understand, because they're not things that are in our culture. But the way to think about this is you have to think think of the position of a manifestation of God or a messenger of God, right? You have, you're laying down standards for, all of humanity in a sense, right? That for everyone, that are universal. And Baha'u'lláh said his faith is intended to be universal. And it has spread around the world, and Baha'is all over the world are following his principles and laws. But you also have a community who's there, who have been already following certain laws. And, derived, most of Baha'u'llah's early followers were Muslim, not entirely, but most of them. And Baha'u'lláh addressed in the Kitabi Akdas different laws, and most of the times he's abrogating something, meaning he's saying you no longer have to do this. So an example that comes from Christianity is actually Baha'u'lláh says that priests can marry. He said it is now the revelation of God. He says, God appreciates the priests, the pious deeds of them over the centuries, but now it is time to enter into the greater world and to serve humanity and to marry. So, coming from a Muslim background, you might not be familiar with that, right? Because that's not an issue in Islam. So Baha'u'lláh addressed a variety of things, and most of them are very reasonable once you understand the background. And most of the time he's abrogating. When you look at actually Baha'u'llah's set of laws and what is actually applicable to us, they're very straightforward, I believe. But if you were to pick up the Akdas and read it, you would encounter things that you weren't familiar with. And that's just because, the revelations of God come within a social, historical context. And, those people have questions too and need to have answers. So.
Thank you. So now we can just take a pause for questions.
I'd also offer that if anyone else has any insights that they'd like to share.
We have a question that asks, does God love us just as much as a mother loves her child?
Oh my gosh. So there's a beautiful tablet of Baha'u'lláh that is provisionally translated, in which an individual has lost his father. And he's grieving the loss of his father, who was a Baha'i. And so I was very struck by this. And Baha'u'lláh tells him, this young son, he says, don't grieve for your father. He says, your father is in a wonderful place. I'm paraphrasing badly. He's in a wonderful place. There's nothing that you have to grieve about. And then Baha'u'lláh says a line that struck me very much. He says, God loves you more than 1,000 fathers. So it was directly related to that question. So I think that's what we should think about our relationship to God, as being one of love, as we love our parents, good parents, who have done great, who really love us and are really given of themselves to serve us. I mean, look at what happened to Baha'u'lláh. He and his family suffered imprisonment. He did nothing except to bring the revelation of God to humanity. He sacrificed himself. He had chains around his neck. He lived in a prison. But what he brought into the world was just this magnificent thing. And so, that's out of love, right? It's not because we deserved it, because we're the ones, humans, who put him in the cell to begin with. And so, I think that's true. There's a lot in the Baha'i writings about that issue.
Thank you. Our next question asks, are there any special diets in the faith or health practices?
No, there are not. There are not specific diets in the faith or health practices. There are comments about, that I'm aware of. Let me just think. I can't think of anything. There are comments of Abdu'l-Baha, both actually, interestingly, Abdu'l-Baha, and I believe Baha'u'lláh mostly, especially towards the end of his life, I know this from a story that was told, ate mostly vegetarian, but were not non-meat eaters, and then Abdu'l-Baha did say that in the future that the diet of humanity would move towards vegetarianism. So, but we don't have any specific dietary regulations, no. You can drink coffee and tea, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks like we have one question. It asks, is homosexuality not also a choice?
Again, I'm going to be expressing what I think. I do not personally think that the data suggests that people, well, I don't know enough about this to say, but here, I believe that people's desires come about through complex factors that are not of their own choosing. One can choose to sort of nurture those desires, or one can choose to ignore them. I do think even with sex, there's an issue of habits of mind and habits of practice that can end up driving how we perceive things. But I don't know enough about this to say. So, but I personally believe that people's experience of their desires is probably through a complex issues of genetic and early development factors that are not of their own choosing. Now, what you choose to do with your desires is your own choice, and that is the challenge. And you know, many people throughout the centuries have made choices. So you know, I think just with anything, we're all given a certain equipment in terms of what we like and what we desire, and all human beings are different, not just sexually, but in any way. Some people have a natural desire to drink alcohol and are very attracted to it, and others don't care about it at all, even though they're given every opportunity to drink it. So everybody's different. So I do think that some of our natural inclinations are natural to us, but I do believe we do have choices in how to express them over time. And I think that that we can modify them, but it's, I don't know. Beyond that, I don't know.
Great. Well, thank you. If we don't have any other questions, then I'd like to thank you again for your talk. I think that these follow-up discussions really helped deepen all of our understandings, brought a lot of new topics to light. So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
And so now I will just introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker next week will be Mr. Steve Sarowitz, and his topic will be why Baha'is believe that all prophets come from one God. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Daylight Time, so please invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please fill out the Google form that we've just put in the chat. And now we're just going to close with a hidden word of Bahá'u'lláh set to music.
Within thee, a breath of my own spirit, thou mayest be my lover. Why hast thou forsaken me and sought a beloved other than me? love my own spirit. But thou mayest be my lover, be my lover.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. We hope to see you all next Saturday. Bye.